Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Johnson, and I'd like to invite you to our webinar series focusing on data-driven HR. We hope today that we'll give you some new ways of bringing value to your organization as a people leader. Today's webinar is about laying the foundation for your organization to become data-driven. With this foundation, you'll be in the position to leverage advanced analytics, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. I'd like to introduce you to our presenters this afternoon. Dustin Wells from Workify, who is joined by Frank Mendoza from Catalytics. Dustin is a proven entrepreneur with a passion for people, culture, and technology. Dustin's first company has been named a best place to work in Texas for about 8 consecutive years. Dustin is a co-founder of Workify and is passionate about helping companies build great cultures. Frank is an unapologetic data geek. He founded Catalytics in 2015 to introduce emerging technologies to artificial intelligence and machine learning to help organizations become more data-driven. Most recently, Catalytics was awarded 3rd place in the IBM Watson Build competition for an innovative AI solution called Detecting Talent. Please join me in welcoming Dustin and Frank.
Thank you, Chris, and thanks, Frank, for joining me today.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
So we have a lot to cover today, and what we're going to talk about first is the market landscape and why change is an imperative and becoming data-driven is an imperative. Following that, we're going to go into real specific examples about how you can apply this knowledge in your day-to-day. While this is a technical topic, the goal is to stay away from jargon and to try to explain this in plain English. We understand that even when you're talking to the CIO about these things, there are terms that are still new. There are things that are hard to understand. And so if Frank gets a little bit too crazy on the jargon, I'm going to pull him back in.
Absolutely.
To make sure that I can understand and so that all of us can understand as well. And so becoming data-driven is a newer concept, but the goal of today, and hopefully by the end of this, you'll understand enough about what data-driven means. You'll understand artificial intelligence and machine learning and how you might be able to use that as an HR leader. But change is an imperative. And so what we found is technology is killing or enabling companies. And there's 3 big areas that are happening in this area. One is Moore's Law. This is a law that basically says the longer that time goes and technology is around, things get faster, cheaper, better. And so that means that we've seen this happen with computers, we've seen it happen with cell phones, but with AI and machine learning, and specifically around analytics and all of these really technical things, we're actually seeing that Moore's Law is accelerating. And that's part of the thing that is making a change an imperative. From a business trend standpoint, we see what we call the rise of the unknowns. And so fewer than 12% of the Fortune 500 in 1955 are on the list today. And so that's a really interesting stat because the older companies, the more traditional companies, are not surviving in the new economy. And the ones that are the ones that are adapting and changing. And then finally, we've all heard of the war on talent. And that used to be a new concept in the early 2000s, and that's just not going away. And so the trend that we've started to see is how do you get to measurement of engagement and then leveraging these other technologies that we're going to talk about today so that you can create an advantage for your company and your workforce. And then another trend that we've seen is the rise of a younger workforce. In the past, we used to call it millennials. Now we're talking about the digital natives or Gen Z. And the expectation here is very different. And the fancy word for this is the consumerization of enterprise software. The non-fancy explanation of that, to reel that in, is essentially the experience that employees have in their regular life with technology is the experience that they want to have at work. So for example, if I go to a restaurant, I can leave a review on my phone in seconds through an app called Yelp, for example. And then I can also get a car, I can post things, I can share things. This sets the bar for what the expectation is at work now. And so as that relates to feedback in data, is employees want to be able to give feedback on their terms, not on the company's terms. So how do we enable that so that we can meet some of those needs? And then finally, we've got a couple of trends in HR. We've got the rise of strategic HR. We've got culture and engagement and diversity and inclusion. And I think what's important here, I'm not going to go into all of these because that's outside of the scope of this topic, but the rise of the CHRO or the CPO has been very strong over the last 10 years. But what we've noticed is that HR is typically one of the most under-resourced departments in the company. They don't have the technical talent, they don't have the talent, the headcount that they need, and they don't have the budget that they need to drive change. Yet they're expected to perform in the same level of functions as their peers, as the COO or the CIO. And so part of what we want to give you today is a way that you can lay that foundation and then equip you with the tools so that you can compete at that same level, even though you have fewer resources to throw at this. And so if we look at what data-driven means, this landscape is really important. And so part of this landscape, you can see probably a lot of different types of systems that you're engaging with today. We've got wellness programs, we've got rewards, we've got recognition, we've got lots in talent management. Workforce analytics is an emerging field, and it's really combining all of these things. But what we found is that measurement, which is what we're calling engagement analytics, sits at the heart of HCM 2.0. And so what that means is the more that you're measuring, the more data you're going to have so that you can take action. And so when we talk about data, there's actually two types of data. There's systems of record data, and then there is employee-generated data. And Frank's going to touch on this a little bit, but the reality is most companies today are relying on systems of record data. Think your HRIS system, like Workday or Bamboo. Think about your talent management system, like Greenhouse possibly. Your learning management system. These are all systems of record that tell you things about people. And this is a really important data set. But if you were to combine that system of record with employee-generated data, the types of insights that you can get are far greater than if you're only using one. And so as we start to look at data, and this is a really fancy slide with lots of pictures, and there's actually a blog post on this that I'm happy to share for anyone that's interested, and you'll see my contact information at the end of this. But basically, the gist of this slide says, start somewhere, start collecting data, but the more that you start collecting data, the more that you're going to exponentially be able to do with that data, all the way up to a really robust workforce analytics solution and business intelligence solution that can leverage the technologies and the tools that we're going to talk about today. So with that said, I'm going to hand it over to Frank so we can talk about what all these kind of acronyms mean and demystify this a little bit.
Yeah, appreciate it, really. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. My hope is by the end of this that you're better armed to have a conversation with those that you need to have strategic conversations around artificial intelligence. And so right now, as you can imagine, these concepts, AI, machine learning, deep learning, data science, really buzzy in the context of popular business articles and things like that. So I want to really just kind of break it down. I like to do that with starting with two quotes to begin with. The first is from an expert in artificial intelligence, Andrew Ng. He's a former chief scientist at Baidu, and he founded and led Google Brain. And he equates artificial intelligence to electricity. The same method and way electricity really transformed all industries, right? Whether it's agriculture, transportation, it's going to have that same effect, artificial intelligence will, across the entire planet. And so if you're feeling overwhelmed from an HR perspective, you're not alone. Every industry right now is currently going through that concept and that new learning curve. The second is, keep in mind, we're far from what they consider general artificial intelligence. This is the ability for AI to think and act like a human. But what I will say is this great quote from HBR, or Harvard Business Review, that says, over the next decade, AI won't replace managers, but managers who use AI will replace those that don't. And so it means, what that means is, start to get your foothold, start to lay the foundation, really start to gravitate towards understanding these concepts and learning as much as you can about what problems can be solved using these new technologies. So many of you have heard of the Gartner AI hype cycle. Well, when it comes to artificial intelligence, we're about to enter what's called the trough of disillusionment. And what that means is people are starting to have these high expectations of AI and they're not coming to fruition. And Gartner suspects that a lot of these new innovations won't begin to start showing productivity until about 2022 or later even. But these innovations are certainly going to be transformational, and they're going to offer a lot of benefits to organizations. So when you start thinking about analytics, advanced analytics, and these concepts, really start thinking about what's been coined the evolution of analytics and how it actually correlates to your business. So when you look at evolution of analytics, really talking about 4 distinct areas here. Descriptive analytics, this includes collecting data and starting to use high-level statistics to understand trends. These are things that most organizations are doing today, looking at averages, looking at standard deviations, percentage of total, et cetera, et cetera. And those are all answering the question of what happened. When you start moving into diagnostic analytics, typically something bad has happened, right? So whether maybe you missed some recruiting targets or you had a larger than expected attrition, you're starting to ask questions of why did this happen? And you'll start looking at tools and resources, things like correlations, things like control charts, et cetera, that start to answer the question of why this anomaly happened in the organization. And then you move further down the evolution to predictive analytics. And when you move there, you're truly trying to understand proactively, how do I develop a response to what's about to happen? And these will include concepts like machine learning and neural networks, and we'll talk a little bit about those. And the last evolution is around prescriptive analytics. So once you want to move beyond just receiving a prediction, you want to understand and offer constraints and maybe have the machine actually optimize to offer recommendations based on those various inputs. So for example, say you're staffing medical technicians for an operation, and those individuals have various skill sets. Well, prescriptive analytics will help you understand what best way to staff those in order to minimize the hours spent, as well as the cost of staffing those. And so when you talk about the evolution of analytics, the first 2 areas are all around developing the insights. The third is around developing predictions. And the fourth is about taking action against those predictions. So right now, don't be overwhelmed or daunted if you're further on the left of this. This webinar hopefully will offer you some insights into how to actually start to move up the chain and further to the right.
Well, I'm going to jump in with a quick question, and I want to encourage anyone to go ahead and throw questions in as you have them, because we do have that live, and we'll be able to get to your questions either real time or in the end as well. But I'll kick it off with this question, because this looks pretty daunting. If I am not even doing any of this right now, and if I am doing this, I'm probably only doing descriptive analytics. And so I think you said 2022 would be as this will start to adopt. I feel like I've also heard that it could take a lot longer, especially to get to the prescriptive side. Like, what's your input on that?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. Again, if you are right now in a phase of descriptive analytics, again, don't be overwhelmed. There's a lot of company along with you. And I think that question, I think you have to take an honest look at where your organization currently exists, and questions to help you do that. You should ask yourself, do I have sources of trustworthy data right now? Do I have the talent necessary to move into predictive and into prescriptive analytics? And lastly, but not least, which is, do I have partners that can help me along this journey, right? To move further and further when perhaps right now a huge investment's not going to be necessary or possible for my organization to move.
Yeah, I think the other thing that's important to note here is you can't go straight to prescriptive.
Absolutely.
Unless you do the pre-steps before that. And so you have to start at collecting data, which is really the call to action today, is start doing something, collect data, that's your foundation. But then you'll go to descriptive, then you'll go to diagnostic. You're going to go through this journey. You can't just jump into the middle.
That's absolutely right. And that's why it's called an evolution, right? Because you're not going to be able to evolve right to the end, right? So it is about laying that foundation, gaining that trustworthy data sources, and then making sure that you have either the talent or the partners, or you're willing to upskill your talent to start to move further and further down this. So let's talk a little about the concepts themselves. So if you start to research or search on Google right now, AI, ML, DL, machine learning, deep learning, those concepts, you may find a Venn diagram very similar to this. Well, it's accurate nonetheless, but I just didn't find it fun. So what I tried to do is I attempted to make it hopefully a little fun and a little bit more memorable. And so I came up with this concept here of turducken. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Thanksgiving dish known as turducken, let me describe it. It's usually offered during Thanksgiving. It's a turkey stuffed with a duck stuffed with a chicken. And it's a very good analogy for what artificial intelligence is. And so at the highest level, artificial intelligence is like that turkey, which is really techniques that enable computers to mimic human intelligence. This is all around the ability to reason, to engage, and to learn. And so prior to AI being very robust, many times when you wanted a computer to do something, you had to hard code it, you had to hard program it. And so if you wanted it to do X given Y, you had to then tell it to do Z, otherwise do A, right? Well, with AI, what you're really doing is giving it, the computer or the machine, information, and then it's learning on its own. So no hard or explicit program is necessary for artificial intelligence to start doing a necessary task. When you move into machine learning, you're talking about leveraging statistical techniques to enable the machines to continually learn. And again, typically a task, not an entire job. And you'll hear concepts like supervised learning, unsupervised learning, and reinforcement learning. Not necessarily go deep into today, but realize those are the concepts that are being discussed when you're talking about machine learning. And deep learning takes it that step further, right? So it usually requires a lot of data, and applications will tend to center on things like speech recognition or image recognition. Think your Alexa, your Siri, your Hey Google. Those concepts are really around deep learning and understanding what they are. And a lot of people think deep learning tastes a lot like chicken.
Everything tastes like chicken.
Everything.
So as Frank said, hey Google, his phone lit up.
Yeah, it was really cool.
Listening to us, and that's pretty creepy. So I noticed that a lot of people are saying that they have capabilities in AI and ML. Their products are based in this, and what I found is that no one's actually doing it well. And I mean, what are your thoughts on that? How many people are actually doing this, and what's the state of the industry right now?
Yeah, what I would argue is right now, artificial intelligence has a lot of marketing associated with it. And what I mean by that is marketers are right now applying the AI moniker on just about anything that resembles AI, right? But for HR professionals, what I would say is focus on the data and analytics aspects of AI, right? So we'll discuss some real world examples here shortly, but what I say is start laying the foundation. The companies who are really moving ahead and doing amazing things right now have already had that foundation laid years ago. And so right now is the time to start.
And when we talk about the foundation, just to reiterate and be really crystal clear, that's data. Like if you're not collecting data, whether it's in systems of record or employee generated data, then you will not be in a position to take advantage of these things coming up.
Yeah, and the sooner you get to understanding that data, and what we're typically talking right now is structured data, the ability to make sure it's clean and it's consistent. Those are going to be the aspects that are going to allow you to move further and further up that evolution that much quicker.
Okay, so if I'm an HR leader, so far I understand some of these concepts, but you're surely not asking me to hire a data science team. We just talked about how HR is the most under-resourced department in the company. They're expected to do more with less. I mean, is that the expectation, or how would an HR leader approach this?
No, it's a great question. So the reality is, I think you have to first start with what problem are you trying to solve, right? For many organizations, achieving insights is really going to be key, right? So are you able to leverage things like data visualizations, the descriptive, the diagnostic? Those are going to be sufficient right now to solve a lot of the problems that you have, that you're attempting to try and solve. And it doesn't mean that you necessarily have to hire a team of data scientists right now. So find partners, lay the foundation, and then start doing the things that are necessary, but really start with what problem you're trying to solve. Great. So let's talk a little about that, since it's a great segue into what really does a data scientist do. So data scientists can be broken out, this is a very simplistic term, of course, but into 4 distinct steps. One is around data mining and extraction. The next is around developing data science insights and machine learning algorithms. And then you move into prediction and data visualization, which then will allow data-driven decision making. So let's break into each one of those individually. Data mining and extraction is really the first step, and it's often the longest step. So when you look at a data scientist is tailored to do, they're really 60 to 80% of their time is what is spent on what's called data wrangling, which is all around prepping the data, cleaning the data, and that's why it's so pivotal that if you're starting now, make sure you have governance and you have systems to ensure that that data is clean as possible, and that you partners also are understanding the importance of that clean data. Once that data is cleaned, and again, taking a big portion of their time to do that, now they can move into the insights portion, what we talked about before. These will include correlations, box plots, statistical methods, and those algorithms. And again, developing these applications and models, it's all probabilistic right now. And what I mean by that, it's all probabilities. Nothing is set in stone. If an AI says it's going to do something, it doesn't mean it really is going to happen. It's all the probability of it likely to happen. Which then moves us into the next step, which is it's all around understanding how is the business going to consume this information, right? So no matter how accurate or how good a model really is, it's useless unless someone has the ability to identify the insight and begin to apply context to that insight. So a good data scientist will ensure that the end user, your HR team or your business leaders will also be part of the process of creating those insights. And this moves to the last phase, which is providing that insight to the business. And this is where judgment and context are key, right? The ability to provide that insight is only going to be as good as the people who are applying the decision making to it. And so I go back to the quote we showed earlier, which is really, you're not going to be replaced by AI, but managers who understand how to use this AI and build a team around them that understand the real value of it are going to replace those that don't.
So we had a question come in, and it's earlier you mentioned structured data is important. What are some examples of HR-related structured data?
Yeah, so you mentioned it earlier, HRIS systems, right? So things, systems of record tend to be structured data. Things that have the tenure of an individual, the performance review of an individual, education, all those things. If you think of it as tabular form or a data table, that tends to be structured data, and machine learning does its best when that data is clean and structured.
So one thing that we see with engagement measurement in programs related to either measuring engagement or new hire, exit, training, 360s, is a lot of that data is tied to statistical indicators that are proven to drive or drain cultures. Employee net promoter score is another measure. Retention is another measure. Are these also examples of structured data?
Absolutely, absolutely. And so what you're attempting to do when you're trying to build these AI applications is try to hypothesize all the various data sources that you could be leveraging in order to build a more accurate model. So if you have those sources, absolutely, those become inputs into feeding a data model to improve its accuracy.
Yeah, what's interesting, and I guess this was an accident, but it was a happy one. You talked about systems of record data, and I talked about employee-generated data.
Yeah, absolutely, both types.
Look, we're being consistent.
Yeah, practice pays off.
So I think now that we're on the data question, and thank you for the question, and keep those coming. This is really important. It's your data, and again, the call to action here is start doing something, start collecting data. Most of us have systems of record data. Some of us might have employee-generated data, but is it structured data? It's a really interesting question. And if you're using SurveyMonkey, for example, it's probably not structured. If you're using a tool, it probably is. And so, but when we look at data, it's your data, but what should you expect as you're partnering either with these tools or outsourced vendors? And what are some questions that you can ask to make sure that you are building a foundation, and that if you switch vendors or you decide to change tracks, that's not going to pull the foundation out from under you that you spent years building. And so when we look at data collection and we look at analytics options, like, this is a good way to think about this. There's a spectrum of do-it-yourself all the way to outsource kind of managed services. And on the do-it-yourself side, like, this is Excel, right? And so if you're running SurveyMonkey, for example, or Google Forms Survey, they have really limited visualizations, and then you're exporting that into Excel, and maybe you're doing pivot tables or other types of cuts. But then if you want to get into more advanced business intelligence solutions, this is where Power BI or Tableau comes in. And these are whole software development platforms, essentially, that let you really go deep into the data. The problem here is the learning curve is really, really steep. And so ramping up on something like this is really challenging. You can also hire for this, but again, going back to the limited resources that typically an HR organization is dealing with, that's not usually possible. And we've only seen people hire for this role in literally enterprise level companies. And then we've got outsourced data. And so these are providers that might help you collect the data, and then they'll give you analytics and reporting. And so the key here, and when we talk about it's your data, that you want to understand what type of access you have to the data. Everyone here gives you the data in Excel format, and that's not all you need. And if you were to stop there, then you would actually not be building your foundation, you'd be starting over. Because there's a lot of rich data inside of, or what we call metadata, inside of formal collection systems like these tools. And so what you want to ask for is really either what's called API, which just gives you a way to get to that data remotely, or direct database access to your data. And so that starts to get kind of interesting with engagement surveys, especially related to anonymity. And so we want to really understand, and when you're evaluating vendors or partners, you want to really understand, like, what's their approach to data and to management of that data, what's their approach to anonymity, and then how can you as a client get access to the data. And so when I'm not going to go back to the slide on the data maturity curve, but when you have access to that data, you can start to combine your systems of record data with your employee generated data with maybe your sales data or your customer satisfaction data. And we're about to go into some real life examples of where that might come up and why that's valuable. And so when we talk about do something, collect data, that's important. The second caveat to that is collect structured data. The third caveat to that is make sure you actually have access to your data, or all of that work for collecting the data is going to go to waste. So I think I just saw a question come in. Chris, will you look at that one first?
Absolutely. So there was a question that came in that was asking, what was the other tool you mentioned after you mentioned SurveyMonkey?
Oh, Google Forms was the other tool. So Google Forms allows you to put a survey together, and that gives you the data in a Google sheet or an Excel sheet, essentially. So that was one of those other tools. SurveyMonkey, Google Forms are free tools that are definitely a good way to get started. We found that companies that are over about 50 employees start to really struggle with that. Over 100, you're really starting to lose some valuable insights when you cross it with metadata. When I talk about metadata, that means department, manager, maybe someone's NPS disposition, like are they a detractor or a promoter? So you can start to cut data by these different things in tools like Tableau or Power BI or these outsourced vendors.
Yeah, and then the key there is also about relationship between the data sources, right? So making sure that you have some keys that you can go off of to ensure that that each of the different data sources all know or talk to each other in the right way. And so when you're talking about disparate data sources, you need to make sure you're thinking about, again, the data governance, how it's being managed as well throughout an organization.
So that sounds really cool, but I'm an HR organization and I don't have a large IT staff. So how do I do that?
Yeah, so I think it's about creating a smaller team, and again, starting with what problem you're trying to answer, right? So it's not necessarily right now, if you're trying to solve smaller problems, to pull in all the different data sources and build an extensive data governance structure, right? So it's, again, start with what problem you're trying to solve, and then understand what data sources are necessary to solve that problem, and then build around that.
Okay. So this is what everyone's been waiting for, I think. We're going to talk about real life examples. And so please definitely submit questions here if you have any other example questions here, and we see some coming in. I think, and then we're gonna save the last like 20 minutes for Q&A. So we're gonna have plenty of time. But let's go into some real examples about how we can use this in HR.
Great. So let's start with an example that I think is interesting because we brought it up earlier. NPS. We know NPS is highly correlated to the revenue of an organization. So can you imagine what is possible if you understood the impact on revenue if you had a 0.1% increase in employee NPS scores? So right now, again, the ability to use eNPS as an indicator of NPS and leveraging machine learning to understand, again, the attributes that lead to a higher eNPS that then would then lead to a higher revenue. All those are going to be necessary to understand that correlation between the two. And right now, the ability for machine learning to identify patterns and attributes are going to be key.
Yeah, there's been statistically relevant studies done on the link between eNPS and NPS. Again, for those that might not be familiar with this, this is Net Promoter Score. It was originally formed developed as a question for customer satisfaction. How likely are you to recommend XYZ to a friend or colleague on a scale of 0 to 10? But what they do is then they group you into a detractor, a passive, or a promoter. Mm-hmm. And what we found, and this isn't our research, but this is out there, is that over time, that NPS was developed to measure internal satisfaction with employees, which is called eNPS. But what the studies show is that there is a statistically relevant link between Net Promoter Score and Employee Net Promoter Score, meaning if your eNPS goes up or down, your customer NPS will go up or down. Now, the last link in that puzzle is, will customer NPS affect your revenue? Most companies, the answer is yes. So there may be a way that you could actually figure out for each 10th of a point in eNPS, what's the revenue impact on the company in the future? And that starts to go to that predictive.
Absolutely. And then again, the ability for an individual to really understand through vast amounts of data, these patterns and these attributes that really lead to that, it's near impossible when you start to get to too much data. But that's the power of this machine learning. This is the power of artificial intelligence. It can sift through that data and identify them so that it could build better predictive, more accurate predictions. Let's move on to the second one, sentiment analysis. So sentiment analysis is using a concept called natural language processing. We talked a little bit about it before. But many times employee surveys and maybe Glassdoor comments have text information, an open box for people to enter information. Well, using natural language processing, you could be able to detect polarity. So that means positive, neutral, negative sentiment inside those text boxes, even get topic information or detect feelings or emotions. So you might be able to provide you insights into trending attitude towards maybe a specific department or an organization or a topic such as maybe health insurance benefits. You start to understand a little bit more than just, are you happy or not happy? Are you, on a scale of 1 to 5? You start to understand what specifically people are talking about and their attitude towards those topics.
So another extension of sentiment analysis or text analysis, I should say,
yep.
is topic analysis. Can you hit on that a little bit?
Yeah. So typically, like I mentioned, organizations will offer an open box, right? And so feel free to enter anything. What you can then use is natural language processing to really identify those things. So everyone's seen the word cloud, for example. So word cloud is a good example of identifying those topics that are coming and floating to the top. Well, you can take it that one step further and find out not only the topics themselves, but the sentiment around those topics as well.
And so if I run a survey, again, let's say I have 10,000 employees and I have 2 qualitative questions, which are open text questions, and I get 90% participation. I've got 18,000 things to analyze now. Like how can I use this to help me understand the trends and what's going on?
Yeah, again, the power lies there in the sentiment, right? Is understanding what those 18,000, the topics they're talking about, the sentiment, whether it's positive, negative, or neutral, and their feelings and emotions. It's amazing the type of information that's now available, and it's only right now limited by your creativity and your innovation in terms of how you
I think it would be interesting because you could probably overlay some metadata on that,
Absolutely.
like department, manager, location,
Yep.
and then you could probably stack rank based on sentiment of qualitative.
Absolutely. Start looking at areas of opportunity, right, with respect to managers, to departments, and those kind of things, and find out.
Cool.
The last example we'll talk about is a flight risk prediction, right? So using machine learning models. Again, looking at historical information, understanding both the meta as well as the employee engagement aspects, introducing those to, again, identify patterns and recognize those attributes that are leading to an employee's resignation decision. And this goes beyond just high-level anecdotes, right? Allowing you to get a little bit further and more proactive, as opposed to waiting for someone to submit their resignation or waiting for exit surveys to be conducted. This is getting you a little bit closer to identifying who you might want to retain and that there's a likelihood that they might be exiting soon.
Yeah, what's interesting is I think this is the hardest one to develop. This is the furthest to the right of that adoption curve that you talked about.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where that system of record data and employee generated data makes a big impact.
Absolutely.
What Frank's not telling you is he's uniquely qualified to talk about this topic specifically because he won an award from IBM for developing an algorithm to detect attrition. And so,
yeah, I appreciate that plug. Yeah, detecting talent is a offering that Catalytics is now going forward with to help organizations, again, proactively identify those at-risk top talent, leveraging both those aspects of an individual and an organization.
So AI sounds like the silver bullet.
Yeah, well, there's some downside. Let's be honest, right? So one thing you have to consider when you're talking about AI is that, and we keep alluding to this over and over again, which is the data, the foundation, clean information, because the old adage is still accurate, which is garbage in, garbage out. So if the data isn't clean, if it's not trustworthy, if it's not representative or relevant to the questions you're trying to solve, then it becomes an improper, inaccurate prediction that's being created. And so keep that in mind as you're starting to talk about AI. And that includes monitoring for bias and figuring out how to mitigate that as much as possible. And there can be bias associated with the collection of that data, the prepping of that data, and of course, the modeling of that data. And then the other aspect of AI is really the over-reliance on AI. I keep mentioning this over and over again. It's probabilistic, which means it's a probability that something's going to happen. It still requires human judgment in human context. If you rely too much on AI, it's bound to fail. So it's necessary for you always to have a human element associated with this. And this is where it's become critical, because these aren't dots on a page. These aren't probabilities. These are people we're talking about. And so that means that we have to understand the impact that these decisions are recommending, and then follow our judgment and our context in terms of how those are being done. I think everybody's probably familiar with the headline here, where Amazon scrapes their AI recruiting tool because it showed bias against women. These are examples that they're not going to be the last we hear about, but it is going to be critical that, as I mentioned before, that all the stakeholders are going to be at the table and able to create these applications together to make sure that that human judgment, that human context is being included. So last but not least, I just like to say that, you know, AI is neither good nor evil, right? It's a tool and it's a technology for us to use. So the hype is going to continue, and so don't be daunted by it. If you haven't gotten started, just focus right now on the data collection and ensure you're laying a really good foundation by starting to build data governance, and then partnering with vendors that are moving towards this future, because they can help you along the path. So I'll turn it back over to you, Dustin.
Yeah, so I think we had a couple questions come in. Chris, will you tell us what we got?
Definitely, absolutely. So it looks like we have a couple of them coming in. So the first question looks like, how do I pick my first project?
You mind if I take this one?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, you know, I would start with quick wins, right? Don't choose a project initially that's going to take years and years to actually fulfill, right? So my steps would include: choose a small team that can be agile, Really define that problem that you're going after and interview those end users to ensure that you understand the true problem of what's happening. And then it goes to the third step, which is identifying data sources that the organization is confident around. And then fourth, look for opportunities to really learn from prior tasks, right? Things like what we call supervised learning, something that a machine or an algorithm can actually learn from. And the last step is probably the hardest here, is prepare for failure, right? But it's not failure if you're learning. And so plan on iterating and continue to learn along the path.
Perfect. Looks like we have another question coming in. Looks like, how long do we have before everyone is using some form of AI or ML?
Yeah, I'll jump in,
Yeah,
and
please.
then you can add to it, I think. So I've actually talked about this a lot with specifically in HR with top companies that are on the leading edge. And the fact is that a lot of companies are talking about it and really few are doing it. And I think that's important to understand. So how do you separate the smoke and mirrors from reality? And that's really the way to do that, is to apply this technology to your data, and you're going to see if you agree with the results or not. And I was talking to a CEO of a very large company in California, and I made the comment, well, in 2 to 3 years, this will be table stakes. And he kind of backed up and said, well, I actually believe it's going to be closer to 5 years. And so, like, this is timely because this is important for HR leaders to understand. This isn't doom and gloom. Like, you have time, but you have to understand how to do this. I mean,
the only thing I'll add to that, right, is the longer you wait, the longer it's going to take, right? And so in that regard, I agree with everything you just said. I think it's going to take a lot of companies potentially years to build that data governance, to get those trustworthy sources of data. But that being said, if you pick quick wins, if you pick problems that don't require as much data, then those are going to be opportunities for you to kind of move ahead that much quicker and start to understand what it will take going forward to stand up a robust AI capability.
Okay.
Gotcha. We got another question that came in, and it looks like it's about your thoughts on employee data. So it says there are a lot of gray areas these days, especially if someone thinks you're spying on them.
Yeah.
So who owns the data?
Who owns the data?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think where we are today is very different than we were even 5 years ago when it comes to data, right? So if you asked me 20 years ago, would you mind if someone monitored where you travel to and how long it takes you to get there and everything? I probably would have said no, but today I have Google Maps and that tracks everything about me, where I go and how often I'm there. So I think, again, similar to the evolution of analytics, I think there's going to be an evolution. That being said, I think that's where HR becomes a critical member and a stakeholder, right? Understanding what privacy is and how comfortable an organization is in terms of providing that information are all going to be critical to leveraging it going forward.
Awesome. Looks like we have a lot of great questions coming in. And so the next one is really, how do we compare results for something like predictive employee attrition across models if we're only working with one vendor?
Yeah, that's going to be hard.
Yeah.
Because you essentially have to launch 2 projects simultaneously and then compare those, I would imagine. I mean, what would you say to that, Frank?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a challenge for sure. And I think, not only are we in the infancy of leveraging artificial intelligence, but we're also in the infancy of understanding the ROI associated with artificial intelligence, right? And so the question becomes, how do you, ideal world would be you gather as much information from as many sources as you can and be able to create those predictive models. But to your point, it's going to be very difficult to when you're talking about multiple vendors and multiple sources there. But again, it's your data. I think Dustin alluded to this and really hit on it hard, which is it's your data and you should have access to it and you should have the ability to do with it with what you want.
Yeah, and Brenda, who asked that question, had a follow up, which says, wouldn't it be preferable to work with only models that are open source so it's easy to switch or compare approaches? And I think that's really interesting. The point that she's hitting on is that there are a lot of open source models, especially as it relates to like text analysis or sentiment analysis. And so while different vendors may have these features, you can ask, what is the underlying model behind this that you're using? Would be a great question to understand. And that means that now you have portability in that tech,
That's right.
whereas an algorithm for attrition would probably be more custom, I would imagine.
Yeah, that builds onto the question of should I build this, should I buy this, or should I outsource this? And I think that's going to be different based on the use case that you're going after right now. If it's core to your business and you look at a strategic competitive advantage to you, it might make sense to build it internally. What I've found is the speed at which you need to get results is going to dictate how quickly and whether or not you should be looking at buying or outsourcing the solution. And so those are all aspects that you need to consider when you're starting to look at open source versus a vendor specific or a specific platform or solution.
Cool. We got another couple questions coming in. And so it looks like this next one is in regards to education. So can you recommend any courses or certifications that we can take to learn more about how to build something like this internally?
Yeah, so there's a lot of great content online to start getting involved with this. One in particular I highly encourage is, I mentioned Andrew Ng, AI expert earlier, a quote around electricity. He offers a lot. He's also a co-founder of Coursera, and he offers through his deeplearning.ai platform there, AI for everyone. And what he's attempting to do in that course is really start to break down the elements of AI. Again, similar to what we did here in terms of machine learning and deep learning, but really understand how people are going to be applying this going forward. So I highly encourage online courses. Of course, getting deeper and deeper into becoming a data scientist and actually building the algorithms will require a significant more investment. But that being said, it's a great stepping stone to start to understand these techniques and tools that much more.
Yeah, I think the challenge too, if you're learning this, it makes a lot of sense, especially to understand the capabilities. I mean, I've gone down that road myself as well. And there's a lot of tools where you can build this in your kind of sandbox environment on
Absolutely.
your laptop. There's a big difference between building something on your laptop and deploying it in a cloud-based infrastructure that's going to scale for your enterprise. And so I think that if you're not a software engineer and you're wanting to learn things so you have a better understanding, that makes perfect sense. If you're wanting to learn it so that you can implement a solution for your enterprise, I would just caution you that there's a lot more involved than just these algorithms.
Yeah, I'll add to that, right? So AI, a lot of people think it's a one and done thing, right? So I create an algorithm and I'm done. But the fact of the matter is it's not. It's a continual, ever evolving application. And so think about, you're going to have to retrain this model over and over again. You have to monitor for bias. You're going to have to monitor for drift of the solution. Things change in everyone's life, and data changes as well. And so to that same point, you want to make sure that if you're building a production AI application, that you've included the right stakeholders to ensure that that application does not go dormant and become irrelevant.
Looks like we have one more question, and I think it kind of goes back to the turducken. So, well, I need to use all three. So, will I need to use AI, ML, and deep learning to accomplish my HR goals?
I'll take that one. I don't think so. I think the answer is no. A good data scientist and a good partner is going to try to, again, understand what problem you're trying to solve and ensure that the simplest solution is used to solve it. Too often, data scientists look at, similar to the old adage, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And that's not really the right approach. The approach is really, what is it going to take? And I mentioned before, it could be data visualizations are sufficient right now to solve the insight or lack of insight that you have into an organization. So no, I don't think all three are going to be necessary or even required to solve some of the problems and challenges that HR is facing today.
Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us. If you would like a copy of the slides, shoot me an email. I'm happy to do that. This is Dustin, and I'll send those over to you. You'll also get a copy of this recording in about a week once we process it, so that if you want to share it with any of your peers, you're welcome to do that. And this is our second in a series of data-driven HR webinars. And so we will be sending a survey out as well, and we'd love your feedback on other things that you might want to hear about. We'd love to invite Frank back or other experts as well, just so you can hear other perspectives besides ours. We just want to be a resource for you so that you can understand what this might look like and how you can adopt and adapt and grow. So with that said, we thank you all for attending, and we look forward to seeing you next time.